For today's good question, Cameron asks, does the governor have the authority to lower the U.S. flag to half-staff or only the state flag? The U.S. government lists the rules for flying the American flag at half-staff on us.gov. Quote, the United States flag flies at half-staff or at half-mast when the nation or a state is in mourning. The president, a state governor, or the mayor of the District of Columbia can order flags to fly at half-staff. They then list the usual circumstances when that happens, including the death of a government official, military member, or first responder, a national tragedy, or Memorial Day or another national day of remembrance. And here in Kentucky, the governor's office says the flag is also lowered to half-staff on Peace Officers Memorial Day, that's May 15th, Patriot Day, that's September 11th, and National Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day, that's December 7th. If you have a good question, you can email goodquestion@wkyt.com, and I'll see you on WKYT Mornings.